Racist flight attendant forces black disabled girl off plane. 11 minutes later, she gets Justice Kendall, a 17-year-old girl from one of South Korea's most prestigious chaebol families, was used to facing challenges. Diagnosed with cerebral palsy, Kendall had long since adapted to a life that combined immense privilege with the daily battles of living with a disability. But her family's wealth hadn't shielded her from discrimination, especially when her dark skin set her apart in ways people rarely understood. But before we dive into what happens next, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below. On her way back to Seoul from a summer spent in the US, Kendall boarded a plane alone for the first time, a challenge she had chosen to take on herself. She was seated in business class, a seat that her family had booked with extra consideration, ensuring she would have space and support for the long-haul flight. This was Kendall's world, a place where her unique challenges were met with the fierce determination of a family who loved her, and a strength she'd built over years of facing both visible and invisible hurdles. As she settled into her seat, a stern-faced flight attendant approached her with a forced smile. "Are you in the right seat?" she asked, glancing at Kendall's boarding pass with a hint of skepticism that didn't go unnoticed. "Yes," Kendall replied, unfazed, meeting the flight attendant's gaze directly. The attendant, however, didn't seem satisfied. She hovered close, casting occasional glances as Kendall struggled to secure her seatbelt, an often difficult task because of her limited mobility. "Let me," Kendall started, her voice steady but strained. But the flight attendant seemed less inclined to help than to scrutinize. "Are you sure you belong in this class?" she asked sharply. "I need to check with my supervisor." Without waiting for an answer, she turned on her heel, disappearing to the front of the cabin. Moments later, she returned with a tight-lipped expression and directed her words not to Kendall but to the surrounding passengers. "There's been a seating issue. This young woman doesn't seem to belong here." At this, murmurs started to ripple through the cabin. Kendall felt the weight of dozens of curious, judgmental eyes on her. Before she could protest, the flight attendant leaned closer, her voice dropping to a patronizing whisper. "Why don't we find a better seat for you in economy?" The insult, thinly veiled as an offer, ignited something deep within Kendall. She cleared her throat and addressed the attendant firmly. "My seat is here, as you can see on my ticket. I'll stay where I'm assigned, thank you." The attendant's face contorted in frustration, her expression slipping from polite to irritated. "I don't think that's possible," she snapped. "Let me get my supervisor." Moments later, a stern-looking supervisor arrived, exchanged a few hushed words with the flight attendant, and turned to Kendall with a forced smile. "Miss, I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to leave the plane," the supervisor said, his tone sharp. He added, "Your condition may make other passengers uncomfortable." The humiliation was complete. Shaken, but determined to hold her ground, Kendall held her seat for a beat longer, her mind racing as she mentally prepared for what might follow. But the decision was made for her. Security personnel were called, and Kendall was escorted off the plane, her quiet dignity intact but her spirit bruised. As Kendall found herself alone in the waiting area, her heart still pounding, she watched the minutes tick by. What the flight attendants and security had missed, however, was that Kendall's family had powerful ties, including contacts in the airline industry. Word of the incident traveled swiftly. Within minutes, her father's legal team was on the phone with the airline's executives, demanding an explanation. Just 11 minutes after Kendall had been forced off the plane, the ripple effects of her family's connections reached their destination. The captain was informed by a furious executive that the flight was grounded until Kendall was reseated in her rightful place in business class. This wasn't just a matter of a chaebol family protecting their own. It was a blatant case of discrimination that demanded immediate rectification. The same flight attendant who had insisted Kendall leave the plane was now summoned back to escort her on board, her expression transformed from smug satisfaction to discomfort and shame. She avoided Kendall's gaze as she mumbled, "Miss, we'd like you to return to your seat." Kendall looked at her, the silent strength of her gaze saying more than words ever could. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had been singled out and degraded, yet here she was, returning not just to the seat she'd rightfully claimed, but to the dignity that had momentarily been taken from her. As the plane took off, word began to spread through the airline and the media. Within hours, the story reached global news, sparking outrage over the blatant racism and ableism Kendall had endured. People around the world demanded justice for her, and the airline's management scrambled to issue a public apology. The flight attendant was swiftly suspended, and an internal investigation was launched. Within days, the flight attendant was terminated, a consequence of her actions, but also a public statement from the airline. Prejudice would not be tolerated, regardless of who it targeted. Kendall, meanwhile, had gained far more than just justice. Her experience highlighted the discrimination that so many people faced daily, and her story sparked a broader conversation. As Kendall stepped off the plane in Seoul, she was greeted by her family's driver and, to her surprise, several members of her extended family, all of whom had been awaiting her return. Her father, a dignified man known for his quiet strength, stood at the front of the group, his face a mixture of relief and pride. He embraced her, whispering, "You handled yourself well, Kendall. I'm so proud of you." In the days that followed, Kendall's story became a powerful symbol, drawing attention to the discrimination people like her often endured in silence. Her family, who could have easily kept the incident private, chose instead to support her desire to speak publicly about her experience. With their backing, Kendall gave interviews, sharing her story and bringing awareness to issues of race and disability in travel and beyond. Her words struck a chord, inspiring countless others to share their own stories and demand change. Soon, airlines began implementing more rigorous training on diversity and sensitivity, with Kendall's incident cited as a pivotal moment that forced the industry to face its own biases. But it wasn't just the airline that felt the impact of Kendall's resilience. She received messages from individuals around the world, people of color, people with disabilities, and even those who simply admired her strength, each one touched by her courage. Her journey inspired others to confront injustices they had once felt powerless to resist. Years later, as Kendall looked back on that day, she no longer felt the sting of humiliation. What had begun as an isolated act of prejudice had transformed into a movement. Through her actions, she had turned a painful experience into a catalyst for change, proving that even in the face of adversity, quiet resilience could light the way toward justice. In the end, Kendall's story wasn't just one of personal triumph, but of empowerment for countless others. A reminder that sometimes the most unexpected challenges hold the power to shape not just one life, but many. And as she continued her journey, she knew that her voice, one strengthened by hardship and resilience, would never be silenced again. Leave a comment if you enjoyed this story. It doesn't cost you anything, and you'll make me very happy. Thank you, and I look forward to your like.